Welcome to another edition of Reedsy Live, our ongoing series of webinars where we bring on professionals from the publishing world and they share their knowledge and experience with you. Today, we've got quite an exciting one. Sam Brody, who's an editor based in Brooklyn, New York, will be talking to us about comp titles. Hi, Sam.
Hello, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm going to bring you up on the screen here. Hey, are we getting you in Brooklyn today?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Are you in Brooklyn today, right?
I am in Brooklyn, as you can tell by the fact that there's a lot of noise outside my window.
I'm going to dip off, but feel free. I'll be in the background tinkering with stuff. Enjoy. I'll see you in a bit.
Hello, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well today. I don't know who said that they were from South Florida, but that's actually my home area, so yay, Floridians. So quick overview. I know Martin said my experience a little bit, but as you said, I've lots of literary experience and sales experience. I've been an assistant at various literary agencies for over 3 years. I've managed slush files for literary agencies for over 6 years. So I've seen definitely a couple hundred of thousands of queries in my time. I've also worked in sales, both domestic and foreign, and I've worked in bookstores. So I've definitely used comp titles on every realm of the arena, I'd like to say. Also, fun fact, the bookstore I worked at was the bookstore from You've Got Mail, which I will be using later as a comp title example. So, fun fact for everyone. So, first things first. What are comp titles? Since I know that tends to be the first question. Comp titles can be comparative or competitive titles. Basically, a comp title is a shorthand to describe your book. And I say think of it as a simile. There are 3 different kinds or 3 different ways to use comp titles. So you can use a comp title as, if you like X, you'll like Y. So for example, if you like Uprooted by Naomi Novik, which is a fairy tale fantasy retelling, you'll like The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden, which is another fairy tale fantasy retelling. They're both set in Russia, they both deal with fairy tales, they both have romantic stories amongst high stakes plots. So that's one example of a comp title, how you can use it. Exactly. The other one, or another way of using a comp title, and it would be, it's X, but with Y. So, for example, You've Got Mail, but with gay teenage boys. That example would be Simon versus the Homo Sapiens Agenda by Becky Albertalli. It was recently made into a movie, Love, Simon. So, that's another way you can use a comp title. It's something, but an element's been changed. It's another easy shorthand to describe your book. There you go. And then the last version of comp titles, and this might be the one that most of you are familiar with pitch events on Twitter or inquiry letters, or that agents tend to use as an example of what a comp title is. It's X meets Y. So that, for example, it's Jane Eyre meets Ghostbusters. And that title would be My Plain Jane by Cynthia Hand, Jody Meadows, and Brody Ashton. That book's a retelling of Jane Eyre, where Charlotte Bronte is actually Jane Eyre's best friend, and she can see ghosts, hence the Ghostbusters in Jane Eyre. So, next is who uses comp titles, and where you can use comp titles. So, first off, comp titles are going to be used by you. That's going to be the most useful place, I'd like to think, and hopefully you won't really need to concern yourself too much where with agents, editors, booksellers, etc. use comp titles. Basically, comp titles are going to be the shortest form of an elevator pitch. It's the easiest way to describe your book because it's the easiest way to elicit interest. I would say a good comp title should let a reader or potential audience member or an agent know what your book is about. And by what your book is about, I don't really mean what its themes are. So it's about realizing that family is about togetherness, or what the genre of your book is. So it's a book set in dystopian future where all of humanity has been wiped out. A good comp title communicates the plot and the setting of your book all at once. And maybe a couple of themes. But really, it should give me an idea of what I'm going to get. And comp titles should be adapted for your audience. So for example, if I'm speaking to someone who doesn't really read or doesn't really like to read, I'm going to use comp titles that are a bit more widely known. So if I'm speaking to someone who doesn't say read young adult fiction, I'm not going to use popular young adult books as comp titles with them, because chances are we haven't heard of, say, The Hazelwood or Six of Crows or something like that. Versus if you're using comp titles when talking to an agent or an editor, you want your comp titles to be genre specific, because they're looking for comp titles that show you know the market and you know the genre you're talking in. So that's a good time to use Six of Crows, Hazelwood, etc. Third, and this is the instance where you're probably not going to be using comp titles, but you could if you're a self-published author, you're an author who deals with these things directly, or you're an author who tends to wander bookstores in hopes of pitching to people directly. You could be that person. I like being that person. Pitching to foreign to film sales. In that case, so for example, for foreign, editors and agents tend to like using comp titles that are more familiar to their territory. So they might use a comp title of a book. They might use a book that's sold really well in, say, Germany when pitching to German agents, or they might use movies as comp titles of pitching to film agents. So it really depends on your audience. It really depends on knowing where you are. For example, when I worked in a bookstore, if I was talking to someone who was a casual reader, I would use Twilight as a comp title because it might be a book that got them to the bookstore, but they might not know a lot of other young adult fiction for me to use as something to lead them to a book. So that's a bit more of an idea of comp titles, how you can use them, where they're used, adjusting them for your audience. Hope that made sense. And that goes into sort of the do's and don'ts for comp titles, which fits into where to use them in a bit of a confusing way. And I think that's where a lot of people have trouble with comp titles. So one of the biggest do's and don'ts for comp titles is don't use too well-known comp titles. And I think that's where things tend to get confusing, because you'll see a lot of books that are already published that do use really well-known comp titles in the summary. And that's because those tend to be aimed at people who aren't readers. So the rule of thumb for comp titles, if you're pitching to agents and editors, which I'm assuming is going to be a decent amount of you, don't use too well-known comp titles. And I want you to look at it as the inverse graph of popularity, which if I was more tech savvy, I would prepare a graph for you, but I'm not. So I'm going to use your imagination, and I don't actually think this is a mathematically correct graph, but we're going to go with it. So the more popular something is, the less your margin of error is and how far that book can differ from what your book is actually about. What do I mean? So, for example, pitching to agents and editors, a big no comp title that no one wants to see is Harry Potter. Why? When I say Harry Potter, what do you guys think of? Orphan child, lonely child meeting friends for the first time, magical school, learning about the battle between good and evil. Learning the battle between good and evil has shades of gray, and morality issues like what is good isn't always or what is right isn't always easy, and what is good is complicated, and things like that. So if you're using Harry Potter as a comp title, as an agent, I'm expecting to see all of those things in your book. And if I'm not seeing that, then your comp title has failed. On the other hand, a comp title like Harry Potter might work if I'm pitching it to someone who's not really a reader, because chances are Harry Potter is a book that you've heard of. So I hope that helps explains the difference there a little bit more. Another thing with comp titles that's considered overused is you don't want to be too specific. You don't want to use a comp title that's too popular within the genre. So for example, going back to young adult fiction, you don't want to use a comp title that's become overwhelmingly popular, like Six of Crows, for example. For those who don't know what Six of Crows is, I would comp it as Leverage in a Russia-inspired fantasy. Leverage is a good comp title because it's popular. Most people have heard what it is, and it's specific. It's about a small heist team. Each person has their distinct roles, and it's set in Russia-inspired fantasy. Six of Crows is the same as Leverage in that it has very distinct characters and a very distinct heist team. Unlike Ocean's 11, which is a bit more wishy-washy, it's just a heist team. There's not a plotter and a thief and a hacker, etc. So I hope that makes sense in terms of using really distinguishing characteristics and choosing what comp titles you use. But anyway, Six of Crows is considered a bit overused now. It's really popular. So if you're using that as a comp title for your YA fiction and you're pitching that to agents, it better hit all of those points, because otherwise the agent or editor who's reading it is going to go, this wasn't a good comp title. It didn't hit everything. So the other case of overused comp titles would be something that's become a cult classic. So this, again, is a bit more subjective, a matter of opinion, something I might think is overused, someone else might not, but something a lot of people are beginning to think are overused, and by a lot of people, I mean agents, scouts, editors, is Stranger Things. That's something that became very popular in the last year. And again, popular, narrowed margin of error. So if you're using Stranger Things as a comp title now when pitching to agents and editors, it really, really needs to hit on everything that Stranger Things has. All right, we have a question. Oops, I was thinking of using Harry Potter meets Sabrina the Teenage Witch, as my story is about a homeschooled witch who is raised and taught magic by her aunt and uncle. And that is from Cara Louise Bingham. You actually hit upon my next do's and don'ts, so perfect, thank you. So my next do and don't is don't use two titles of the same genre and plot. And that is a general do and don't that applies universally whether talking to a reader or an agent and editor. So basically, the purpose of a comp title, again, is you want something that tells what the story, that communicates what your plot is about. So if you're using a comp title that is really similar genre-wise to each other, it's not really going to communicate the story because they're not different enough for me to be able to pick out what the unique elements of each other are. When you say Sabrina, you think witch. Witch who's keeping it a secret. Witch who's keeping it a secret with her aunts and uncles, and there's a cat, and teenage drama. It doesn't really immediately associate with homeschooled, versus Harry Potter, again, all of those same characteristics. So when you say Sabrina meets Harry Potter, I'm not really sure what your book is about, because there's a lot of overlap in characteristics. So I can assume it's got witches, and I can assume it's got teenagers, but I still don't really know what the plot is, because Sabrina doesn't really have a distinct enough plot, and Harry Potter has a very distinct plot, but from what you just said about your book, it's not really similar to the plot of Harry Potter. So I hope that makes a little bit more sense about why that wouldn't work as a comp title, and why using two comp titles of the same genre or a similar plot doesn't really tend to work. And that also goes into the idea that when you're using comp titles, try to have at least one comp title have a really specific plot, if you're using another comp title to set the tone. So for example, one good and one bad example of a comp title would be Breakfast Club meets 16 Candles. They're both John Hughes movies set in the 80s. They're both about teenagers dealing with teenage things. But I couldn't really tell you what the plot is based on just that comparison, because their plots are pretty similar. I mean, they both deal with romance, they both deal with complicated romance, they both deal with clique issues. I guess that's the word I'm using. Clique issues in high school. One has the theme of detention. One has the theme of crushing on the wrong person. But it's not really a specific enough plot. I'd say they're more theme specific or setting specific comp titles. On the other hand, Breakfast Club meets Pretty Little Liars gives you a really specific idea of what the book is about. And that's actually the comp title that's used for One of Us is Lying by Karen McManus, current New York Times bestseller. That gives you a really specific idea of what the book is about. So you have Breakfast Club, which is about teenagers, detention. You know, it's got that sort of teen drama thing going on. And Pretty Little Liars, similar. So it skirts the line a little bit, but it's also got that teen drama who killed it aspect of it. So, you know, it's got a group of 6 defined outcasts and a whodunit killed it mystery. I'm not going to say it's the best comp title I've ever heard, but it does its job in that it gives you an idea of what the book is about and what the plot is. You know someone's died. You know that it's about 6 people with defined outcast roles, or define click roles, and you know it's a whodunit plot. So another example of a don't use the same genre plot might be Star Wars meets Firefly, but et cetera, et cetera. All right, we have another question from Nanette Nianabar. I cannot see the rest of your name, for which I apologize. Can you use classic titles such as Pride and Prejudice meets Twelfth Night? Yes and no, which is not an answer, so I'm going to explain that. So, yes, you can definitely use classic titles. I, in fact, love classic titles as a comp title, and I think those tend to be really popular with agents and editors because everyone likes something that they're a little bit familiar with. However, I wouldn't use them together because I think that falls under the category of same genre, same plot, or same feel. So, if you're saying Pride and Prejudice meets Twelfth Night, those are both really specific plots. So, I'm not really sure which plot you're going with as for your book. And I think that creates a lot of confusion there. So, for example, if you wanted something that's set in Regency era or something that's set in Shakespeare era, I might say something like, I would use a comp title that evokes the feel of the era versus, and as well as the other comp titles. So Shakespeare in Love meets Twelfth Night. That would evoke more the feel of Shakespearean era meets the plot of Twelfth Night, or Shakespeare in Love meets Pride and Prejudice. Never mind, that makes more sense. Shakespeare in Love meets Twelfth Night, which I think is more what you were going for. And then the other hand would be Twelfth Night meets something set in the Victorian era, depending on what kind of feel. If you're going for more gas lamp, more mystery, more classic events. So it really depends, but I hope that makes a bit more sense there.
Yeah, it's Martin here. I was just wondering, like, when you do those sort of this meets that kind of comparisons, is there sort of like a normal order to it? Like, if it's like, Pride and Prejudice meets, I don't know, the Wonder Boys, whatever, is the first one always like the more plot-led one? So the first one describes the plot and the second one explains like the tone and setting, or does it not really matter?
I wouldn't say it particularly matters. It might. I tend to assume the first one is plot and the second one is more setting, personally. But I think if you're using something that has a really specific plot versus a more general like theme or setting to it, it'll be pretty obvious to the reader. Something I would tend to say as practice is pitch it to a couple friends, pitch it to your family, and see what they say and what their first impression is to get an idea of what order works.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. Just to let the people know, I can see there's a bunch of questions coming up. I'm going to let Sam just sort of go through the next little bits, but just keep the questions coming and I'll save them until the Q&A at the end. Okay, me out.
All right, perfect. All right, so wrapping up so we can get to Q&A. So the last thing the last two things, and I think I've talked about this pretty much already, is a big do when picking comp titles is think about a title's most common associations when picking comps. So is it something that you really associate with a specific plot? Or is it something that you associate with a specific theme or setting? So for example, Breakfast Club, which I've used now, you associate it with a really specific sort of theme and setting, not really so much a specific plot, I would say. And that, when you say Breakfast Club, I would say what comes to mind is specific cliche or specific people who represent specific cliques. Detention, high school. Not really a specific plot, because the plot of the movie isn't really the important part of the movie. It's about them bonding. Versus if you say Ocean's 11, that comes to mind heist, revenge plot. Very specific, pulling one over on the audience and the people who are in charge of the banks. I don't actually remember the plot of Ocean's 11 that well, to be honest, but I have a specific association when someone says it. And it's heist. So use that when thinking of comp titles and putting them together, because you want to have an idea of what someone else is going to think when they hear it. It's sort of that idea of you know your book really well, but someone else is reading it and they might not have the same background as you do, so they might not know, oh, this world building element that you have all planned out in your head, but is not actually on the page. So try to keep that in mind. And again, I think I went over this a little bit more before, but just to go into it a bit more detail, breaking rules and how to break it. So when it comes to things that are really, really overused, like Harry Potter, here's an example of when it works, because I do think that's important to show. So The Magicians by Lev Grossman is a book that uses, and a TV show now, that uses Harry Potter as a comic title. It works really well because this. So, Magicians was often described as grown-up Harry Potter, or Harry Potter for millennials, or Harry Potter set in grad school, or Harry Potter meets Chronicles of Narnia, something along those lines. And that works really well because The Magicians is about a group of college students who are attending a magical school. The protagonist is a lonely boy who meets friends for the first time. They encounter a battle of good versus evil. He discovers that he is supposed to conquer this overarching bad guy who's their version of Voldemort. And they discover the battle between good and evil is a bit more complicated than we thought. It hits a lot of the same thematic points as Harry Potter. A lot. So that's why it works. It lives up to the promise that it's giving you. And is it risky to use it? Yeah. And I think that's what you need to really think. Are you giving the payoff that you're promising the reader, or the agent, or the editor? Because if you're not, chances are you're going to hurt your book more than help. So, like I said, inverse graph of popularity. Really, really make sure that if you're promising something that's really popular, your book fits that comparison to a T.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Sam, for joining us today. We'll have a link to Sam's profile on Reedsy if you're looking for an editor to work on your book. What kind of titles do you specialize in, Sam?
I specialize in young adult, romance, science fiction and fantasy, and women's fiction.
Fantastic. So if you want to check out her profile, go to reedsy.com/Sam-Brody. You'll see some of the books she's worked on and the experience she's had. But otherwise, thank you very much for joining us today. I'll see you guys soon. Bye.